So this is my reflections and commentary on Proverbs chapter 27. I finished last time with verse 18, and I'm going to continue now with verse 19. As in water, face answers to face, so the heart of man to man. So there's been a series of verses so far. The past couple have been in this pattern, or relative pattern. Verse 17, iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Verse 18, whoso keeps the fig tree shall eat the fruit thereof, so he that waits on his master shall be honored. Again, once more, verse 19, as in water, face answers to face, so the heart of man to man. So I'm going to be taking my slow and methodical approach to thinking about this verse. I want to bear in mind that the Proverbs are, I think, the primary purpose of the Proverbs are to act as a key to open the door to some broader insight. There are always multiple interpretations. There's not just one path to what is being said here. The beautiful part about it is that every individual can, while following set principles that are laid out in the proverb, every individual can paint their own image, find something interesting and beautiful to see in that image. Now, that's not to say that there is an infinite number of avenues to explore. Of course, we are limited by the constraints of the prompt that we are given. But it ought to be a creative process. So in my breakdown and its intricacy, I may miss some overarching simplicity that may be common among many interpreters. For that, I apologize, but this is, I feel, how I understand things best. So beginning with the first part of this verse, as in water, face answers to face. On the surface, on the face of it, it doesn't readily seem apparent to me what this means. So I'd like to begin by talking about the term water and then the term face, outlining some descriptors and then trying to piece together some congruencies for which we can find some meaning. So starting with water, what can we say of its properties? First thing that comes to mind is its fluid nature. Another term that comes to mind is chaotic. Often with water, we think of the potential for a flood, or this swell and covering. It might bring destruction, but it can also bring life. It can bring nutrition. It has a sustaining element to it. There's a sense in which water divides, and yet in the former example that I had mentioned, it also unites, in the sense that it sustains. There's a way in which water can liberate. Water itself possesses the great potential, great power. This power can be used for destruction, and as I've mentioned, life and liberation. as in water, face answers to face. I think if I peer down into a pond or a lake, I'd find myself looking back at myself. It has this reflective quality to it. And among everything that I've said, I would like to keep that in mind. But seeing now this image of a person that is crouched on the bank of a river, of some lake, pond, whatever, there's a particular mood that I'm imagining, perhaps a solemn tone, an inquisitive mood, a sense of peace following a long day, perhaps. Now that time has found one in a place that they can think outside of their various going-ons. In the sense I mean, they are no longer in this perpetual state of participation, which I think is a good thing, can be a good thing. And now they are afforded the opportunity to reflect, and this, I think, usually brings about a certain mood, a sense of fairness of mind, a sense of honesty with oneself, when one is truly wishing to enter into this space. And peering into this place, peering into the face, I think one sees an honest reflection about the state of things, about the state of one's life, and the affairs therein. In this particular image that I'm thinking about, of course I imagine myself to a degree. I imagine the way that I am and the way that I can get. At times melancholic, but again at times inquisitive, thinking about existential matters, thinking about where I'm going in life, where my next step ought to be. And in these situations that I find myself with this existential questioning, there are many questions that come about. The face that is presented, of course, is not something that is known to me before I look into this water. But as I peer into it now, I find myself exposed to that honest expression. I am face to face with myself. In a sense, I'm communicating with myself. And there's an answer, I think, in that face-to-face interaction, if one is well versed in the communication of faces, that certain disciplines expose us to. Interacting with people, although difficult in many situations, can afford us many luxuries. Can train the mind and its profound capacity for sociability to communicate with people and to express oneself in such a manner that communicates quite effectively through the face and emotions. I suppose there's no sense in skirting around the topic. I wonder to myself what answer my face is prompting or suggesting, since I am face to face with it. There's a way in which this pursuit may be limiting because it's just one person. But of course, we are prompted to consider water. And it's not as though another person's face would be on the other side of that water. Or very unlikely to be. So I see him crouched there on the bank of that river, thinking to himself, reflecting about himself, about his behaviors and about his actions. About what he would like to accomplish and where he falls short of his goals. And of that shortness for which he falls, I find a desire to rectify or to change. Within these varying ripples of water, I think about the variability of mind, of its potential for coherence, but also potential for dissonance, perhaps incoherence. A mind that wishes to be at ease, but finds ease in all the wrong places. That tries to do well, but inevitably falls to sin. That wishes not to fall into a Sisyphean tragedy. Wishes instead for a Sisyphean triumphancy. A heroic story. And among the failings, it is not as though each one of these is a stone that is placed upon my shoulders to wear me down, although it may, but rather to the mind that is answering me appropriately, perhaps, as I see myself reflected in this water. The face that appears to me can either be the one that is worn down, or the one that accepts responsibility and takes up the burden and lessens that load, one stone or one brick at a time. Spending time more effectively, executing goals as they ought to be executed. But perhaps more importantly, more fundamentally, is to pay attention to my own thoughts. to funnel them, to sharpen them. Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. I should treat myself as this friend, and sharpen this countenance. As I mentioned in my reflection on that verse, this countenance is much more than just a facial expression. It goes all the way back up the chain to the very aspects of mind that formulate thought and that lead to the expression of emotions and behaviors. And so here I have this image of a self-reflective process, of a face that sees one's own image in water as that natural mirror. As in water, face answers to face, so the heart of man to man. So I want to outline another way of conceptualizing this. The first part I'm satisfied with, that self-reflective process and my own awareness of myself through that process. We are instructed to consider the face in water. That water in this context has this reflective capacity, but also serves as a frame for which man is bound within its borders, let's say. Of the frame, I think we can speak a lot of. That's another potential path to explore this verse. The general relationship, though, between the face and the frame, I think is to facilitate reflection, as if one were to pass a mirror on the wall or a picture of oneself on the wall. And it's not just any old picture. It is a picture that occupies a certain expression. It could be a current expression, which is why I think the mirror might be an appropriate metaphor to water. It has that reflective capacity. But nonetheless, it is something that gathers one's attention and facilitates this self-reflective process. The man is encapsulated in this frame. Now, when we think of the heart, I think here, instead of just the interpersonal, or rather, the intrapersonal within oneself, that at least my interpretation of the first part of this is intrapersonal, whereas the second part of this can be expanded to the interpersonal between people, so the heart of man to man. And in this way, the image that is here is still that of man within a frame, but the frame, instead of water now, is the heart. And the heart is something that is reflective, certainly. It's reflective in the sense that it is shared among men. And because that shared experience, it affords us this mutual understanding through experience. And as we consider the self-reflective process, as we engage in it, as we become more proficient at it, and as we use it to correct error in our lives, to move away from sin and towards God, I think what must inevitably become apparent is the removal of oneself, away from oneself in a sense. Not completely, not like an abstract sort of thing, but in the sense that the self as having the capacity to blind and to limit now becomes a being that affords more openness and reciprocation, as in the case of this shared experience of heart. Now, this self-reflective process, or has become, generally speaking, a reflective process that includes not just the self, but a sense of the expanded self, in the sense that we can understand the experience of another because of how intimate we understand ourselves. And it creates this bond by which that experience, by which we grow and we learn, can be shared among people, man to man. Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. So today is a new day. As usual, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'd like to begin by talking about this word hell, to open it up a little bit and see what I can make of it. Hell has an interesting conception in my mind. I think about the modern idea of the term hell, or at least the modern idea as it appears in my mind. This is somewhat separate from my actual feelings on the matter, my true definition of the term, perhaps. But in the sense that perhaps once upon a time I viewed hell, or in the light of how some of my close friends may view this term, it seems that hell occupies a place that is unreasonable in the minds of some. That it is something of an empty vessel, something of an age that people once had believed in, but now no longer, because we know better. The concept is archaic. But in what way has the value escaped its holding cell? What way can a modern man approach this term and reinvigorate it? Have it be something that is relatable and practical? This hell. I see in my mind, now thinking practically, or rather thinking about reinvigorating this term, of course not entirely exposing it to something new, because of course it is attached to previous conceptions. Conceptions in the sense that there is a way in which this hell is a place. There's a way in which this hell is a state of, or just generally a state of mind, a state of being. There's a way in which this hell is a temporal thing, and yet also at the same time atemporal. It is a concept that permeates all of these distinctions and categories. And it's not one of them that defines it. It's within them that hell exists, or can exist. Moreover, from that, I think about the subject. I think about my mind. And I think how I experience hell. For hell is something that the mind of man surely interfaces with. I could say, quite simply, that hell is a negative thing. Poorly descriptive, it would seem. I could say that hell is a place that I know based on my worst experience. And yet there may be another person who may say that their hell is the worst that they have experienced. And in comparison to my example, theirs may be worse, or of a better description of what that hell is. For in that case, I should surely be thankful. But this hell, I suppose there are multiple ways I can define it. It comes to me most readily as a state of mind. I think of popular conceptions. I think about a place, perhaps a symbolic place in which people go. That is the tormented souls, the people that are burning in a fire for eternity. And yet, it comes to me again as a state of mind. A state of judgment that leads to a type of damnation. But much like hell, the word damnation is difficult to describe. I think perhaps a bit less than hell, the word damnation has terms that are associated with it that are a little bit more palpable. Judgment leading to damnation. Speaking of my own experience, I have found myself in a state of mind. I found myself carrying on, following a certain flow, being moved by certain forces, for which I concern myself very little of. And what happens to me in that scheme, whether it be whether it takes me down or it takes me up, the will, the directed part of me, submits to something, submits to a desire, submits to absence, a state of mind that is tunnel visioned, attentive only on one thing, and that one thing is to serve some poor intervention, some apparatus into the computational network of man's experience that leads to the corruption of the network. Certainly of the individual node. Now, these sorts of things that I mentioned can be borne on any number of scales, and yet they can be spoken of, I think, the same, if one understands where they lead. Judgment and damnation. The thing that I find so distressing about hell is its potential subtlety, and by extension the subtlety for which damnation can find us. For the mind that is sufficiently damned, they don't feel the pain of that judgment. And perhaps I could be wrong here. But in this type of experience, as one may find themselves in the throes of an addiction, or in the despotism of selfishness, hell is not a place where they feel the heat of the flames. Hell is a place that they don't even recognize that they are being consumed and destroyed. Redemption is a beautiful thing, surely, but also quite painful if one has let themselves go to be burned by the fire. Certainly it would feel better, more comfortable, to be numb again to the pain, to be unaware of shame, to be unaware of their failures, of their sins, of my failures, of my sins. The place of hell, a courtroom and a jail cell. A place of torture and a place of slumber. A place that exists in time, in a particular place, and yet exists without time, without form. Hell and destruction. Destruction, a term defined, at least by Google, as the action or process of causing so much damage to something that it no longer exists or cannot be repaired. The action or process of killing or being killed, a cause of someone's ruin. So in all of these, we have the ending of some identity. Destruction. Certainly a negative connotation. The ending and the reconstitution of identity, perhaps not a negative thing in and of itself. But the manner in which I suppose that it is ended or destroyed would give reason to something being positive or negative. hell and destruction are never full. So what does this sense of fullness mean in the context of these things? If I were to say, well, what does full hell or full destruction mean? Well, we could say that destruction, as a form or as a term, itself is never satisfied. I think something can be completely destroyed, in the sense that the pen that I hold in my hand here, for this to be destroyed, I can imagine putting it in an incinerator, and then the end result is that this pen is no longer perceivable. There would be nothing by which the human mind can grab onto a piece. The pen cap would be gone, nothing would exist of it. There would be no way for an individual to come to understand this pen as I know it to be. But this is one level, or one layer of destruction. For what is being said in this verse, that the very concept of hell, the very concept of destruction, are never full, in the sense that there is always something there to be ended, to have the identity potentially be threatened with absence or annihilation. Again, per Google, to be damaged to the point where the identity ceases. The thingness is no longer in existence. Likewise with this term, hell, as I've tried to describe, that hell is like a beast, a form that is not satisfied with those that it torments, with those that it destroys. It is something that perpetually carries on. It is something that exists upon this plane of mind for which man's mind plugs into. Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. Now that's quite the comparison. Kind of a sad comparison in a way. I suppose in a sense it doesn't look kindly on the species of man. Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. The eyes of man are never satisfied. What are these eyes of man? So I'd like to take a second and think about a thing or two. The first thing I want to mention is that possibility to explore the path of some physical analogy. Most of the time when I'm thinking about the Proverbs and more generally of biblical interpretation, I tend to not use direct physical analogies, because usually that sort of thing gets us caught up in material causes which we may not be concerned with. But there is undoubtedly strong analogies that can be drawn from the physical causation of things that relate to our purposes. And while the eyes of man, as it is mentioned here, imply something that is more than just physical sight, there is an interesting way in which we can think about that process by which we come to see something. In the broader sense, in which the eyes of man have to do with the broader integration of information from the physical world. That is, what he observes what he sees, and by extension what he thinks, and what he does with his thoughts. So thinking about the first instance here of that physical phenomena of sight, as light enters into the eye, there are a series of steps that occur to focus, to filter light, to focus it on the retina so that the image is clear, so that when the cells depolarize and send us information about the objects that light illuminates, that we are able to accurately perceive it so we can participate in the environment. It would be quite a strange thing if I put my pen on this table and I was unable to pick it up because of some abnormality in my perception of where the pen is. And while the direct physical causality of this may not necessarily be entirely useful to explain the broader meaning of this, the second half of this verse, I think that the aspect of focusing attention, the constant fine-tuning of things, to have them scale in a way that's appropriate to the environment that the agent finds himself in, is an important component to understanding, again, this broader, purposeful concept being the eyes of man. Now, my eyes in the physical sense, it would be a bizarre thing to say whether or not they are satisfied. If they are satisfied, it would be satisfied in the way that they achieve their purpose. The cells take in information and depolarize. But it would be a strange thing to say that by this mechanism, something is satisfied. When we talk about satisfaction, we imply the subject. We imply that agentic arena that the subject is operating within. There is an implication that desires have been met. Something has been fulfilled. Now, surely there is more to be said here before we get into the consolidation of this verse, the rather strange way it's introduced. I find this in my own experience. I find the desires, both good and bad, difficult to fulfill. I had the thought earlier today that of the pursuit of goodness, not always is it the case that doing good feels good. And there's the rather difficult problem or dilemma of maintaining a certain posture. We can call it maintaining a certain faith, maintaining a certain level of vigor, of attentiveness, of output, perhaps. That the more, again, from my perspective, that I give, the more I gain, but also the more I long, the deeper my longing becomes. And it can be a kind of a painful experience, chasing after these desires. Again, assuming that these desires are oriented well, that they are after some good purpose, that I wish to do others well. I wish to teach myself skills, to learn information, and however imperfect I may be at it, the attempt is there. There comes a time of indulgence. There comes maybe I should say temptation, for which indulgence is around the corner in the face of fatigue. A general restlessness after a prolonged period of attention. I found that resistance to such things can yield good results, but also, if given into that fatigue and that temptation, it can be quite devastating for a number of days. If the mind is allowed to just go, release in some way. Suppose there are all types of releasing, some harmful and some positive. But regardless of what it is, the mind is always on. It is always running. The eyes of man, constantly seeing, always conscious, and always aware. Even in the waking hours, I think of a prison cell, a torturous environment in which the lights are kept on. It makes it difficult for a person to fall asleep and understand what time of day it is. Sometimes, I feel like my conscious experience is that way. Although I may not have trouble falling asleep, during the period for which I'm awake, the light is always on. There's never a period for which I can feel like I'm not burdened by something, burdened by existence, that I must be doing something. And surely there are moments where I feel that I can be at peace, but only if I put forth sufficient effort, that I can find myself in some sort of flow state, for which that voice in my mind is not telling me it's hard to know exactly what it says. It's more of a feeling than an expression of language. But that intensity of feeling goes both ways. It finds itself in the place of stagnation. It prompts into action. It understands that action and the achievement of a particular type of action, like I had mentioned with the flow state, is ideal, because then one can truly be at peace. They can be one with whatever they are attending to or working on. But it may come at a price. If the mind is not strong enough to handle that sustained, focused attention, it can falter, it can waver again and desire some indulgent practice. To satisfy Much like the first part of this verse, there is this sense in which, by the very definition of hell or destruction, the work of it is never done upon the conscious landscape. Its possibility, endless. Much like that much like the ideas behind hell and behind destruction, the eyes of man are something that are always seeing, always experiencing. And one would hope that the eyes of man don't find themselves peering into hell or being destructive. Surely there is more that man is capable of. What I find interesting here is the comparison. Why compare it to such a negative thing? But I suppose the reflection is, of this experience, of this conscious experience, again, this is the way that I perceive things, the way that I feel, to an extent how I feel now, but of course I'm engaged in something, and so that the piercing, stabbing sensation that prompts me into action is not necessarily injuring me as much at the moment, though I am pushed to find some solid reason, some solid point to round this verse out, to bring it home. Much like hell and destruction, the possibility for torment within the experience of man, I think, is always present. There's a way in which we can deal with our suffering. I suppose, depending on what we focus on. There's a way of falling into this despair and the hell. That longing is something that can be sweet, but also something that can be like a robber that steals, that our very vigor and desire to participate in life may feel like it is being drained from us. And so as a matter of reflection, I find it to be a matter of wisdom to decide and to act on the good path, despite the temptation, despite the ill feeling that may arise, despite the realization that true satisfaction all the time is probably not something that he will find, that within his experience, happiness will come in waves. It will be intermittent, but it is his duty to do that which is good and to continue to explore and to understand how to be better and to solve problems more effectively. Otherwise, he will find himself in this place of stagnation, for which the mind is not progressing. It is just this stationary thing that is constantly being judged, or that is constantly destroying itself, bringing it to a state of pacification, mind-numbing pacification, through the use of whatever it might be, drugs, the endless amount of information on the internet, any number of adverse or dangerous behaviors. So again, what I'm getting from this, especially in relation to how my experience has been of late, it has been much like this wave. It has been up and down, stable. The waves haven't been too intense, but there is this oscillation. And I never cease to be wondrous at the valleys and the peaks in these waves, that how strange reality seems to be when the desires are not met, when the mind is exhausted and agitated. In those moments, it is where the potential for something beautiful arises, because we are in the valley. And as life is concerned, from here we may just rise towards another peak. We climb the mountain, Sisyphean to a degree, but not a tragic story. For I think that these peaks are cumulative. We learn and we gain from them. It makes the troughs or the valleys manageable, and perhaps even enjoyable if we take advantage of the rise. But it is within prudence, I think, that man and his willful decision-making, that he does not find in the valley destruction and hell, because inevitably he will find himself on that plane. As the fining pot for silver and the furnace for gold, so is a man to his praise. So there's something quite fundamental about this that I would like to bring up at the outset. And it has to do with the nature of the self. Now, I don't necessarily want to use the term the true self, but selfhood in general, what the self can be in relationship to what it is. I think at the core, one of the potential fundamental elements of man is his awareness. It is his awareness of self and of his ability to change aspects of himself. The ability to self-reflect, the importance of that, I don't think can be overstated. His ability to learn, to change, and to adapt, likewise, important aspects of his character, of who he is. So today is a new day. Now a matter of picking up where I left off. So today happens to be a Sunday evening. This is the week before Christmas. We have a shortened week this week with regard to work. An early day on Tuesday, a day off on Wednesday, and we resume Thursday and Friday. So getting back to this verse, as the finding pot for silver and the furnace for gold, so is a man to his praise. This capacity to change, as I was speaking about, the ability to transform, to be reborn, is an interesting quality of man. And as this finding pot suggests, as the metal, silver, and its impurities are put into this apparatus, as the intense heat separates the impurities from the purities, they can be removed from the surface. And so there are two fundamental parts of this. If we think about this silver in the finding pot as the overall experience of man, the finding pot, I think, is meant to illustrate the difficult times in life. These sort of valleys, or climbing the peaks, perhaps. There's any number of ways that we can approach this. Wherever we find ourselves in doubt, or upon some sudden, or perhaps known change that is to occur, the pressure that we are put under is a test. It is always a test. How we respond to it is the measure by which the silver is separated from the dross, or those impurities. Likewise, the furnace for gold, another process by which gold is refined or shaped in a way that one wishes to have it, that intense heat that changes the object, that transforms it. And as a matter of my own experience, this process of transformation, as I mentioned the other day, this process of transformation, I think, can be quite slow. I think the mind may wish for something that is quicker, faster, but one must be patient. Change is something, surely, that is driven by will. But a person that desires change is coming from a certain perspective, from a certain place. And the journey of change is long. If we're speaking about ontology, or the fundamental aspect of being, we're talking about shifting from one state of being to another. And so it's not necessarily about an arrival, but more so about how one thinks and behaves. And I think that the difficulties that I have sometimes when thinking about becoming better, being stronger, I find myself getting wound up in the arrival. That I know that I am on this journey but my mind, for whatever reason, wishes to have an end point. To cross that finish line, and once I've crossed it, I can lay down and just experience bliss. But of course, this is not the lot of man. Life, regardless of how we choose to be, will be full of difficulties, frustrations, but also beauty and wonder. So is a man to his praise. Now, praise is always a potentially dangerous thing. Similarly with pride, but they're not inherently negative. So a man to his praise. I think it can be said that the degree to which a man may feel or somebody else may attribute admiration or approval, and again of himself, a feeling of approval of his being fundamentally, comes from this testing. It comes from that process for which he has faced the intense heat, the struggle, the suffering, the sacrifice. Now, in my particular case, I have made the decision to be a faithful person, to be a man of faith, so that I believe in certain things. I believe in the truth. I believe that there's a way of being that can orient one in a way to his surroundings, his relationships, himself, such that he can think and feel more deeply, access a part of this experience, a part of his mind, that illuminates, that increases the overall vibrancy of his experience. It doesn't mean that the faithful person will find bliss or will find a sense of peace in their enlightenment. But it does mean, I think, that when these times of testing come, that he is oriented fundamentally to accept that challenge. And to learn from it. But again, as far as my weaknesses are concerned, where I need to improve, I recognize strongly that I must be putting myself through regular challenges, a degree of suffering that I can handle without getting burnt out, let's say, but also a degree of challenge that is sufficient enough such that I am actually being forged under this fire into something stronger, more robust. And at times I find, when I mention these ups and downs, when I'm at the peaks, or when I'm ascending that mountain, let's say, I know that what I am participating in is good. The sacrifices that I am making are good, are appropriate. I may find myself faced with a difficult challenge, and then the descent comes. Perhaps there is something that I just do not understand how to adapt to, and it takes time to go through that valley before I can work my way up again. And it's not at every point in that place that I feel strong and steadfast in my resolve. Often I find when I'm coming down the peak, into the valley and into the trough, for which I find it difficult to see in front of me where the next peak will be, the next purpose that I can dedicate myself to, and have a strong commitment and unwavering progress towards that thing. What I need to work on, again, is staying resolute in the valley. Staying resolute in the face of some purpose I know to exist, but has left me in this desert without water to quench my appetite and my thirst. The growing appetites, I suppose, can be seen as fuel to future purposes. And what I, again, need to work on explicitly is when I find myself there, that I don't fall to my knees in pacification or laziness and say that that journey will be there tomorrow. Because of course it will be. But if I say that to myself, I am not making any progress on that journey. I'm not putting one foot in front of the other to find that peak. All that it is doing is saying that that peak is going to be farther off. Your time here is going to be pronounced and prolonged. There is a positive and a negative consequence in my mind that occurs here. The negative consequence is, as I've mentioned, the purpose that I am to find is pushed off later in time. The positive is that there is this build of existential anxiety, perhaps, that snaps me into action at some point. And I think that putting rest aside, which I think is an important aspect, and there's a certain way to rest appropriately, and not just sleeping, but to enjoy a type of leisure that is productive. But putting this rest aside, again, I envision this valley between two peaks, the peak that I had just come from, which perhaps I'll outline this a little bit as I envision it. I imagine the ascent of some peak to be the acquisition of some purpose. Now one can take this full on, reach the peak, or ascend and then fall down because of some weakness back into the valley, back into that place for which the unfortunate soul sees this plateau as a place of negative feelings, a place of suffering. And I will say that this place is a difficult place to be in. There is suffering involved, but not inherently negative. If the person is to make it upon this peak, they have made it through that furnace, they have made it through that fining pot, and the various layers that might suggest, as a silver, a valuable material, but not as valuable as gold through that refining process, and even more intense heat. As the person goes through these gradations, reaches the top and feels that praise, that approval from beyond him and within him, the point at which his ontology is in agreement with his heart, I could say. That might be a strange way to put it. And then, again, the journey begins anew. After some goal is accomplished, a new one is set. The descent down from this peak. and into this valley, into this plateau. Where I need to improve is that when I find this plateau, that the negative feelings don't consume me, but rather I deny them to the point that my pursuit of this new goal is not hindered because of it. Though you should bray a fool in a mortar amongst wheat with a pestle, yet will not his foolishness depart from him. So there's a few words here that I think I need to outline in order for myself to understand this. So the first word, bray, it's a word that's associated with donkeys or mules. It's a loud, harsh sound. It's a harsh cry. In the human context, it can be meant to speak loudly or harshly to or at. A mortar and a pestle, this is something that many of us will intuitively understand. It is a device for which we grind up medication, plants, wheat in this case. We have to remember that although this is a physical analogy, we have to extract the symbolic purpose behind this. And I think it's useful both of thinking about the device, the mortar, the bowl, that eventually that pestle, that sort of porcelain hammer-like object fits into this bowl and grinds down the material. It's important to understand both of these objects, but then also the specific substance that is mentioned here, which is the wheat. So in terms of this mortar, we have this bowl. We have something that holds something. It is the place for which this grinding is going to take place. And I think we can use the prior verse to assist us a little bit here. When we think of the furnace or the fining pot for that silver, and the overall process, the intense heat that separates out the impurities, the machine, the apparatus, is that environment that facilitates the change to occur. So not an insignificant thing. When we talk about the process itself, we're speaking of a separation, or at least the desire to separate. In the case of the wheat, our goal is to make this object, the substance, edible. And we have to separate out the parts of the wheat that are difficult to chew or digest. So this transforms the grain into a form that can be processed into bread and other types of food. So if we take our fool, which I'll speak of in a moment, we put him in this metaphorical mortar, and we grind him down in this pestle. What we are wishing to separate are those inedible or improper aspects of him that do not necessarily fit with a properly functioning human being. Now the question of, well, what parts of a man would make him less than human or make him less edible? Again, that term edible, the equivalence there, I've been thinking in my mind to use human, to be less human. But that might not be accurate, because a fool is just as human as anybody else. But there is a way in which the fool makes the human being less of something. And in the way that the wheat is something that is fundamental to us, that it provides us with nutrition, but it is something that needs to be separated in order for it to be used, in order to fulfill its purpose. The fool in this way represents the same sort of situation. The transformation of the fool is one that must meet a certain purpose. And this is what I would like to explore when trying to define the fool. We've done this many times. In fact, chapter 26 is a chapter of the Proverbs that I have coined, that I've termed the chapter of the fool, because of so many references, so many verses that are attributed to the fool. So the fool is somebody that I have been describing as generally a person that is unwise, a person that is not attentive to the patterns in the environment, not perceptive to the broader environment, whether that be given intricate social cues or the broader social discussion, the broader place that he occupies in the social sphere. Attributing his observations appropriately to an act, to execute goals, purposes. All of these things are disrupted in the foolish person. Now in chapter 26 I put forth this idea that every person has an internal fool within them. It's hard for me to say if there is a person that can be foolish completely outright. I suppose it is, but we all have this fool within us. For better or for worse, I think the fool can reveal to us our ignorance. The fool can be sort of like a comedian, in a sense, a court jester, in which it says things that are counter to that which is some established narrative, for the sake of pointing out the inconsistencies in that established narrative, while understanding that if the established narrative would be destroyed, it would create profound instability. And an action like that, a sophisticated action like that, would be foolish, because we need mental stability throughout our day. We need to be able to interact with people and objects in the environment, so we can't completely destroy our ability to perceive. This is in the extreme case. But also, we can't destroy our ability to have effective relationships either, or destroy important relationships. There would be many different effects that occur there. And so this fool, although a negative part of us, serves as some utility. I'll leave it at that. Now I will say that perhaps there is a certain threshold for which the fool occupies a space within us that, at least in terms of common understanding, somebody would then be willing to label somebody as a fool. And I think that we all know somebody, hopefully it's not ourselves, that no matter how hard we try to intervene and to modify the way in which they approach problems or whatever the case might be, the person fails to make the appropriate adjustments. And I think this is the type of person that we are being prompted to consider here. Certainly it can be the case that the mechanism of the mortar and the pestle can have a positive effect in separating the parts of the grain that are important for us and that are edible, and that more of the dross, that part of the silver that is an impurity, or that is part of the wheat that is inedible. It doesn't serve the purpose of providing us with sustenance. It is possible that this foolish sensibility can be ground down, can be worn away through that pressure, like the previous verse, suffering, testing, learning. But there's a way in which this verse is suggesting of a particular class of person, that it will not be possible to redeem them, I suppose, which I have trouble believing. But again, there's a way in which this strikes home, I think, to many of us, especially with people that have difficulties with addiction. Intervening at that level sometimes is just impossible, or at least it seems impossible. And what ends up happening is that we begin to suffer because of our intervention in that experience. It is beyond us. We do not possess the strength or the power to do such a transformation. And so I think that this verse is a warning to us about these potential types of individuals. A certain sense of self-preservation may be necessary here. Be you diligent to know the state of your flocks, and look well to your herds. So I should mention that today is a new day. It is a Monday today. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. So let's begin with this word, diligent. So the first word that comes to mind when I think of the word diligent is attentive. The first thing that comes to Google's mind when I search for a definition is having or showing care and conscientiousness in one's work or duties. And conscientiousness means the quality of wishing to do one's work or duty well and thoroughly. So I suppose, undoubtedly, attention must play a crucial role in wishing to do something. If I want to do anything, I have to have a sustained attention to grasp a goal and keep it in mind without getting heavily distracted, such that I am unable to finish or to complete the goal. To do something thoroughly, I think, also requires a large amount of attention, such that not just the relative goal, but the end for the sake of the end. That is, everything under one's desire or wish to do something must be accomplished. This work must be done well. There are no loose ends. So, when thinking about this flock, perhaps in my mind I think, well, this seems a bit antiquated. We don't think in terms of flocks anymore. We may think about our families, we may think about those that we work with, or those that are underneath us in the sense of a subordinate. We may think, rather unfortunately, or fortunately, who knows, and in my sense I think somewhat unfortunately, relative to a flock at least, we may think of our material possessions and how to manage our monies and the value therein. But having said that, I do want to dive into this word flock a little bit more. When I think about the term flock, I think of a collection of animals that are necessary for the future survival of, let's say, myself, for my family, for those of the local in-group. So of the flock, I'll say that there's a sustaining element to it. Much like in the verse previous, when we talked about wheat, there is that sustaining element to it. There is a necessity in having this flock and managing it. And it's quite easy, or it becomes quite easy once we think about it, how this flock relates to our own experience. For something to be sustaining, or rather I should say, in our modern day, in any day, there must be something that sustains man, whether it be his flock, or it be his job, his corporate job, his business, whatever it might be. And bound up within all of that are various different responsibilities and affairs that he must attend to. And this sense of conscientiousness, the sense of diligence, comes to mind here, and how appropriate, how important that is, not only for future success, but for the maintenance of what is already sustaining. Now I understand that this is going to be getting into the weeds here, but state is an interesting word. It implies a condition that one is in. But of all of our subtle suffixes, or perhaps prefixes of our words that seem to indicate a state or a condition of, there are so many. And whenever I go through the etymology of a particular word, and I see this applied to it, it never immediately makes sense to me. And perhaps I could say that it never really does make any sense to me. That this condition is something so dependent, conditional, that it's almost impossible to find the essence of the word unless it is given a form, given a particular worldly grounding to it. But of this condition, of this state more broadly, if we imagine ourselves within this bubble, that we are in this condition, the bubble represents the condition. Well, what is this bubble made of? It can be made of order. It can be made of quality. It can be made of shape. It can be made of circumstance. It can be made of environment. It can be made of many things. And indeed, if we think about the state of ourselves, it is indeed many things. It occupies all of that. It occupies order at many levels, many qualities, many shapes, many circumstances. If we think about a flock, likewise, the same applies. That within that bubble of condition, there are plenty of different things that one must attend to. The order of the flock, the general distribution of the flock, where the various elements are, what environment the flock is in, how the internal environment, let's say, the general disposition, as far as we can gather what the internal environment of the flock is. We could see it expressed perhaps in the general health of the animals. And then how that relates to the external environment, the external quality. Again, there are many things that we can examine and pay attention to. But herein lies the issue. Herein lies the issue for my attention, I don't want to say deficit, but attention sporadic mind. Because the mind recognizes so many possibilities that it's difficult to focus on just one. And I must wonder why that is exactly. Here I find myself getting into the point of this verse. As far as I am concerned, as far as my mind relates to or interfaces with this reality, I seem to struggle with focusing my attention on something in light of all of the various elements that surround me. And I so strongly desire some focal point that maintains my attention, where I am not drawn in all of these different directions. And I have to wonder what that lack of restraint is from. And of course, I work at building those restraints so I can have that focal point, that logos of attention that is needed. And among all faithful people, I would have to imagine that that process is an experience of faith. It is by coming to a logos of attention, developing one's logos that agrees with the conditions that he is in at the various levels, his immediate condition, but also perhaps the broader cosmic condition. And look well to your herds. So this is surely an animalistic reference, whereas before, I have to wonder, it can refer to many different things. It can refer to a group of people. It can refer to domestic animals. But either way, both are important. Both, I think, occupy this space that we had mentioned. They both require that type of attention and diligence, that desire for the completeness of one's work, to ensure the safety, the general condition of those animals, because there is this strong relationship, a series of affordances between the people, but also the animals. Now, the other way in which I see this is that the flock includes the smaller animals, smaller domesticated animals, sheep, goats, And of the herd, we have the larger animals, the cattle, oxen. But what we have here is a matter of scale, whereas the flock may need material that is less. They need less land to graze. It may be a specific type of land, whereas the larger animals, more space. And we have to account for these differences, recognize and account for those differences. And as I think about my life, and I think about the various ways in which accounting and recognizing differences is important, it's hard to enumerate them. It just so happens that I am involved to a degree at identifying certain types of pathology. And then in this process of identification, there is often many different variables that one must attend to. And among attending to the various variables, it is not as though there is a solid answer once one has all of the variables in play. One hypothesis may be reasonable and lead to some test. Some test can produce some result that one did not expect. Perhaps it's a negative result. Then I have to go back to the drawing board and figure out exactly what to do next, where to place my attention. Much of this comes with experience, repeated trials, recognizing patterns. But of course, it never fails that this sense of diligence has to be tested. That if one desires the job to be done right, then one must undergo this tedious process of failing and of sometimes succeeding. For riches are not forever, and does the crown endure to every generation. So riches do not endure forever. Here my mind goes immediately to material riches. My mind goes to wealth. It goes to money. There are plenty of ways in which we can extend this and say that there are plenty of different types of riches out there. It can be extended into relationships and to life itself, to health. But sticking with wealth and with money, which is what probably the common conception, the common definition in the mind of somebody reading this would be, well, we say that riches are not time independent. That eventually fortune, wealth will run out. That we will not live forever. That our satisfaction that comes from such things is temporary. Now, there's a way in which I think this could be taken to the extreme, that one desires poverty because riches don't last forever. But I suppose that we can just as easily say that for poverty are not forever. There must be this middle ground, a middle ground of participation, such that we don't commit ourselves to a form of piety that is absolute resolution, but we also don't commit ourselves to a life of luxuriousness, that it blinds our eyes to that which is truly valuable outside of that which can buy us material satisfaction. And does the crown endure to every generation? The crown, a particular civic institution, civil institution, civil authority, I think we all understand that the crown does not endure to every generation. Just thinking to English history and how volatile the crown was, and how different the kings were in their participation and the utilization of their authority. We can say that, in a certain sense, the crown was not passed on, or is not passed on, when it does not represent what it once had in a previous generation. Now, there may be a series of generations that get something, a product, a type of leadership that is quite similar. But eventually the monarch becomes this wholly different thing, whether it be because of some usurpation or some conquering, or just some difference in character and in personality, difference in condition. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'll continue next time with verse 25 of chapter 27 of the Proverbs.